For millions of viewers, James Best will always be remembered as the bumbling, loud, and endlessly frustrated Sheriff Rosco P. Coltrane. He was the man who tripped over his own feet, wrecked police cars, and chased the Duke boys with more enthusiasm than success. On screen, Roscoe felt spontaneous and chaotic, like a character powered entirely by impulse. But behind that performance was an actor who lived by the exact opposite principles. James Best believed deeply in preparation, discipline, and respect for the craft of acting. To him, comedy was not accidental. Every stumble, every shout, every exaggerated reaction was planned with precision. Audiences never saw the quiet seriousness that lived beneath the character's clownish exterior. They only saw the laughter. What they didn't know was that behind the scenes of the Dukes of Hazzard, James Best would eventually make a decision so firm, so final, that it permanently changed how the show was filmed. It wasn't a dramatic meltdown. There were no headlines or public feuds. Instead, it was a silent line drawn by a man who refused to compromise what he believed acting should be. Long before Hazzard County existed, James Best had already lived an entire career grounded in old-school Hollywood values. He came up in a time when arriving early wasn't optional, where knowing your lines was considered basic respect, and where rehearsals mattered just as much as performance. Best trained under Lee Strasberg, one of the most influential acting teachers of the 20th century. That training shaped everything he did. Acting, in his mind, wasn't about instinct alone. It was about intention. Every movement had meaning. Every pause served a purpose. Over decades, he appeared in hundreds of television episodes, working steadily and quietly alongside legends of the industry. He wasn't chasing fame. He was building trust. Directors trusted him because he never wasted time. Crews respected him because he never showed up unprepared. Younger actors often learned simply by watching how he worked. So when Best accepted the role of Roscoe, he didn't treat it like a silly paycheck. He treated it like a challenge. He wanted to prove that even broad, physical comedy could be smart, structured, and professional. What viewers saw as wild improvisation was actually carefully constructed chaos. James Best studied Roscoe the way another actor might study Shakespeare. He analyzed the character's rhythm, his physicality, and his emotional logic. He rewrote lines to sharpen comedic timing. He refined gestures so they felt intentional rather than random. Even Roscoe's signature laugh wasn't spontaneous. It was crafted. On set, Best's habits stood out immediately. He arrived earlier than almost everyone else, often 30 minutes before call time. His scripts were filled with handwritten notes, arrows, and underlines marking where he would move, pause, or react. If blocking rehearsals were rushed or skipped, he didn't complain loudly. He simply asked calmly for a moment to confirm the movement. To him, that wasn't being difficult. It was being respectful. Some cast members admired this discipline. Others didn't quite understand it. But no one could deny that when the camera rolled, James Best delivered consistently, every single time. Actors like Catherine Bach noticed his influence right away. She later spoke about how James quietly reminded the cast to stay focused, especially during long, exhausting shooting days. Denver Pyle, another veteran on the show, shared Best's old-school mindset. Between them, there was an unspoken agreement. Comedy only works when everyone takes it seriously. But The Dukes of Hazzard was not a traditional production, and it was about to change faster than anyone expected. When the show debuted, it exploded almost overnight. Ratings soared. Merchandise flooded stores. Suddenly, what began as a modest television series became a national phenomenon. With success came pressure. Scripts arrived faster. Stunts grew bigger. Schedules tightened. The production pace became relentless. For many, the chaos felt exciting. For James Best, it felt dangerous. He understood speed, but he also understood cost. And he could see the cracks, forming long before they became impossible to ignore. Originally filmed in Georgia, the show eventually moved production to California to maintain tighter control over logistics. That move came with a punishing rhythm. Episodes were now completed in just 7 to 8 days, an unusually fast turnaround even by television standards. The crew worked 6 days a week with minimal rest. Scripts sometimes arrived the morning of filming, still being revised while actors were already in costume. For younger cast members, the pace was overwhelming but thrilling. John Schneider was barely out of his teens. Tom Wopat was adjusting to sudden fame. Catherine Bach found herself under intense public scrutiny as Daisy Duke became a cultural icon. Everyone was learning on the fly, doing whatever it took to keep up. James Best watched all of this with growing concern. Preparation time vanished. Blocking rehearsals were shortened or eliminated. Creative discussions disappeared. Scenes were rushed. Adjustments happened mid-take. To some, this felt energetic. To Best, it felt careless. Rather than adapting by loosening his standards, James Best doubled down. He continued arriving early. He insisted on understanding every movement before the camera rolled. He asked lighting crews to follow charts precisely. He requested clarity whenever dialogue was altered. These weren't power plays. They were attempts to preserve structure in an environment that was losing it fast. Over time, two different rhythms formed on set. One relied on instinct, improvisation, and familiarity. The other relied on planning, repetition, and discipline. At first, they coexisted peacefully. But as the pace intensified, the gap widened. What began as a difference in style slowly became a difference in values. By the fourth season, the tension James carried quietly had reached a breaking point. Fame had settled in, and with it came habits that were harder to excuse. What once felt like inexperience now looked like indifference. James Best didn't explode. He didn't shout or accuse anyone. Instead, he grew quieter. Between takes, he stopped joining casual conversations. His focus narrowed entirely to the work. When scenes ran long due to missed cues or improvised lines, he didn't argue. He simply requested another take calmly. But those who worked alongside him noticed the shift. One crew member later described it as watching a fault line slowly form. There were no dramatic confrontations, just a growing silence that carried weight. And there was one actor whose behavior consistently disrupted the rhythm James worked so hard to maintain. Late arrivals, unopened scripts, joking during rehearsals, improvisation that undercut timing. None of it was malicious. But to James Best, it represented a lack of respect, not just for him, but for the craft itself. The breaking point came during a courthouse scene that required precise timing. It wasn't a complicated sequence, but it depended on rhythm and coordination. James prepared the way he always did, staying up late refining dialogue and movement. He arrived early with his script marked and his performance ready. The other actor did not. Nearly an hour passed after call time. The crew waited. Cameras sat idle. When the actor finally arrived, there was no apology, no urgency. Someone joked that it wasn't a big deal. Another comment suggested James was overthinking the scene. That was the moment everything changed. James Best didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He quietly placed his script on the table and walked off the set. Production stopped instantly. An emergency meeting followed behind closed doors. Schedules were already tight, and losing a day of filming was costly. When the director asked James to return for a private conversation, his response was brief and measured. He said he would not continue filming under those conditions. That single statement ended the day's shoot. There were no press leaks, no public acknowledgement. Everything was handled quietly. When James returned days later, the atmosphere had shifted. Scenes were reorganized. Rehearsals were separated. Blocking was revised so certain interactions were minimized. No one explained the changes out loud, but everyone understood. James Best hadn't quit. He hadn't demanded anyone be fired. He had simply refused to work beside one person in an unprofessional environment. For years, the identity of that actor remained unspoken. Fans speculated. Some blamed the Duke boys. Others pointed to the pressure surrounding Daisy Duke's fame. But people who worked on set dismissed those ideas. Respect had remained intact there. Eventually, another name surfaced, one that surprised almost everyone. On screen, this actor appeared gentle, earnest, and kind. His character often stood beside Rosco, sharing warm comedic moments that fans loved. That made the truth harder to accept. Crew members later described a pattern of friendly behavior slipping into distraction. Improvised lines disrupting structure. Casual jokes during instruction. Late arrivals that threw off the day's rhythm. None of it cruel, none of it intentional, but to James Best, it crossed a line. James never addressed the incident publicly. He never named names. In an industry that often rewards confession, he chose restraint. To those who knew him, that choice made perfect sense. He believed professionalism didn't require explanation. The show continued. The illusion of unity held strong. Audiences never knew anything had changed. Sheriff Rosco remained as funny and energetic as ever. Behind the scenes, however, boundaries had been set. James best finished the work he committed to, but only on terms that respected his craft. When the series ended, he quietly stepped away from the relentless pace of television. James returned to teaching, opening acting classes where discipline mattered more than ambition. Students were expected to arrive early, know their lines, and respect everyone in the room. He often told them talent meant nothing without preparation. Acting wasn't about being noticed. It was about being dependable. Those lessons became his true legacy. Not controversy, not conflict, just consistency. And in the end, that quiet walk-off said more about James Best than any interview ever could. In the years after the Dukes of Hazzard, James Best didn't chase fame. He didn't try to rewrite history or defend himself. Instead, he focused on the part of acting that mattered most to him, the work itself. He took smaller projects, painted, taught, and lived away from the spotlight. Yet he never stopped believing in discipline. He understood that the industry was changing, faster schedules, looser standards, more improvisation. But he still believed the foundation of any performance was preparation. He wanted to pass that belief on to the next generation. He didn't want young actors to think success was built on charm alone. He wanted them to understand that respect for your scene partner, for the crew, and for the audience is what makes a performance truly strong. He wanted them to know that being funny or charismatic is only half the job. The other half is being reliable. And he believed that reliability was more valuable than fame. James Best's approach wasn't just about personal pride. It was about protecting the art. He saw acting as a responsibility, not a hobby. To him, comedy was not an excuse to be careless. In fact, comedy required even more precision than drama. A joke falls flat when timing is wrong. A physical gag becomes dangerous when choreography is ignored. He knew that. He had seen productions collapse because actors didn't respect the process. So when he drew a line on the Dukes of Hazzard, it wasn't about ego. It was about protecting the integrity of the work. He didn't want the show to become sloppy. He didn't want his character to become a joke outside the joke. He didn't want the entire cast to accept laziness as normal. He simply refused to let the craft be treated as disposable. The story of James Best's walk-off has become part of Duke's lore, but the truth is deeper than drama. It's a story about a man who believed in standards when standards were disappearing. It's a story about what happens when a production becomes so successful that the pressure to keep going overwhelms the need to do things correctly. Many people look back and assume it was a simple personality clash. But for James Best, it was never personal. It was professional. He wasn't angry at the actor. He was disappointed in the lack of respect. He had built a lifetime of reliability, and he refused to throw that away for convenience. In the quiet way he handled the situation, he showed something rare in Hollywood: integrity. And that integrity continued to shape the show even after the incident. The production adjusted. The crew learned to avoid conflict by simply changing how scenes were arranged. Interactions were minimized. Blocking was altered. Lines were rewritten to reduce dependence on close cooperation. To the audience, the show remained the same cheerful escape it always was, but behind the scenes, the atmosphere had changed. People became careful. They avoided tension. They learned to work around the boundary James had set. And though the show never publicly acknowledged the conflict, the impact was clear. It changed the way the cast interacted, the way scenes were shot, and even the tone of the performances. A silent rule had been set, and it stayed in place for the rest of the series. The fact that this happened on a show known for its fun and carefree image makes the story even more striking. The Dukes of Hazzard was never meant to be a serious drama. It was a light-hearted adventure with explosions, car chases, and laughter. But even in the world of comedy, James Best treated his craft like a sacred responsibility. He understood that comedy doesn't exist without structure. He understood that the audience doesn't just watch a character, they watch a performance. And if the performance is sloppy, the character becomes weaker. That's why he insisted on preparation. That's why he refused to continue when he felt the set was no longer honoring the work. In a world where most people are willing to compromise, he stood firm. Over time, the story of James Best's refusal became a lesson for other actors. Many who worked with him later spoke about his quiet professionalism and how it influenced the set. Some younger actors who witnessed the incident said it changed their understanding of what it meant to be serious about acting. They realized that discipline wasn't about being rigid. It was about respect for the crew, for the audience, and for the art itself. James Best's decision was not about power. It was about boundaries. He didn't want to be seen as difficult. He wanted to be seen as dependable. And in an industry full of drama and headlines, that quiet strength became his real legacy. When the series ended, many fans assumed James Best would miss the spotlight. But he didn't. He moved into a quieter life, and that choice reflected his values. He didn't need applause to feel fulfilled. He found satisfaction in teaching and mentoring. He enjoyed passing on the lessons he had learned from a lifetime of disciplined work. And he kept his silence about the conflict, refusing to turn it into a scandal. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. He knew that the truth would eventually come out through the performance, through the respect he showed to others, and through the lasting impact he left on the people he taught. That was his way of winning, not through drama, but through integrity. James Best's story reminds us that the most important battles aren't always fought loudly. Sometimes the strongest stand is a quiet one. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply refused to continue working in conditions he believed were unprofessional. That decision changed the way The Dukes of Hazzard was filmed and shaped his legacy in a way few people understand. To the audience, he remained Sheriff Rosco, a lovable clown who could never catch the Duke boys. But behind the laughter was a man who treated his craft like a promise. He proved that professionalism isn't something you only use when people are watching. It's something you practice even when no one notices. And in the end, that's what made James Best not just a memorable actor, but a respected artist.